The recent policy decisions that have been taken by the British government, championed by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and also the Minister Suella Braverman, have received mixed reactions. There are many who have said that this is racially targeted, but this all came because of the conviction of perhaps the largest gang involved in systematic sexual abuse, and that too targeting especially white women. A large number of the convicts were of British Pakistani origin. They've been called the grooming gangs, and this is not a recent issue. This has been decades-old menace. So what exactly are grooming gangs? Let's try and understand this concept altogether. This, since the turn of the century, has been a menace which, because of political correctness and somewhere fear, has been brushed right under the carpet in Britain. Grooming gangs are people who sexually exploit vulnerables. It is a group of people who sexually exploit vulnerable women of society. They target young girls and then go after them and then repeatedly abuse them. They try to brainwash them, intimidate them, and of course, the attitude of such people, these gangs, is that women are objects and they have to be treated thus. Victims of these girls and of these gangs are largely underage girls. The victims of these gangs are often underage girls who are targeted and profiled racially. They're largely, the girls who've been targeted are white women in Britain. And they've been targeted by these gangs who have been seen in largely smaller cities and where there are concentration of the Muslim population and also those of British Pakistani origin. This is as per reports. Over 1,000 kids were abused in Shropshire's Telford. Now, this is according to a report. Over 1,000 kids were abused by these gangs in the Telford town in central UK. Telford is a very, very small town bordering Wales, and this incident came to the fore way back nearly a decade ago in 2014. Now, these issues and these aspects have started further manifesting themselves, and there have been further reports that have happened since the psychological manipulation that has also come in terms of the process that's been used. The victims are abused through a process of psychological manipulation, and majority of the accused were of Pakistani origin. And as Charlie Peters, who spent a year investigating these grooming gangs and also spoke to whistleblowers and survivors, has come out and said that they are largely from Mirpur, Muzaffarabad or Pak-occupied Kashmir. That's where they largely belong to, and they are all clannish in nature, and from these clans they get the gangs. Majority of the accused in such cases were British Pakistani men, and the numbers of the concentrations are humongous. In Telford, the total number of women who were abused in a very, very small town was nearly 1,510. Now, let's give you an idea of how these grooming gangs manipulate their victims. Firstly, the gang builds trust with their victims, and then they may offer them gifts, give them lots of attention, and of course, affection to try and gain their trust and make them feel special. Then they isolate the victim from her family and friends, and then they start brainwashing her, luring her. They limit their access to phones or the internet. They persuade them to keep secrets from their loved ones. And these young girls are at a very, very impressionable and vulnerable stage of their growth cycle. They're very, very young. The intimidation tactics are then used to then control them. They will use these tactics. They'll make videos. They'll hit them. They'll abuse them. This can involve threats of violence or harm to the victim or their family if they refuse to comply with the gang's demands. Drugs and alcohol are also used to manipulate the victim. And this can also make it easier for gangs to sexually assault the victim without any resistance. The victims, because videos are mailed, personal info, photographs, family, so there is also this element of blackmail that is used to further control. Several reports on this issue have come out since 2014 that have shown that cops were afraid of launching probes or bringing accused to justice because they feared of being branded as Islamophobic. There were also a bombshell report published in in 2014. That was the Alexis J report, and also the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. It was data that was gathered from 7 years of hearings and testimonies from 725 witnesses. The IICSC report was also there, where nearly 1,400 kids were subjected to sexual abuse, and this came from the IIC report in 2014, so more than a decade ago. Then there were cases of the Rotherham case, 1997 to 2013. The report published was based on these cases. Perpetrators were mostly of Pakistani origin, and girls aged even 11 years were trafficked across to northern England. And the report also mentions that agencies should not fear affecting community relations, and that people must be able to raise concerns without being labeled racist. But time and again, MPs, politicians from both the Conservative and the Labour parties have raised this, but they have only been slammed. Journalists like Andrew Norfolk have been also criticized for putting stories out and also calling the bluff and also exposing this dark truth of the of Britain, of the United Kingdom. He did it back in 2013. But the counter that's come forth is that there is not enough evidence to stereotype Asians and blacks. The 2020 Home Office research says that there is not enough evidence, but the numbers are clear. The report suggested that this kind of abuse was carried out by young white men. The suggested abuse was carried out by young white men is what this report suggested. But the evidences, the convictions, the details that have come out, even in Grooming Gangs, A British Shame, this documentary has very clearly said, this investigative GB News investigative documentary released this year, titled Grooming Gangs, Britain's Shame, focuses on the grooming of mainly underage white girls by men of mainly Pakistani heritage across England. And this is the evidence. The sample size is skewed towards this ethnicity. It should not be there in any community, but that's the reality. And this report and this investigative documentary claimed child abuse was perpetrated by British Pak men. This documentary claimed that they systematically did this. They claimed that the issue was ignored by cops for nearly a decade. And this was largely because of political correctness and fear of being labelled Islamophobic. So UK's Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has also issued a statement defending this crackdown. She has gone ahead and said that no matter what, vulnerable white English girls are being trapped, drugged and raped. And I'm not going to mince words. There will be no political correctness. Most of the accused are British Pakistani men, is something that she has come out and openly said. She's copying a lot of flack for it, but she's continued on this path. Child sexual abuse is one of the most horrific crimes, and she went on to say that there will be no political correctness and the crackdown will happen. It devastates victims and their childhood has been robbed. The despicable abusers must be brought to justice. This is her position. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had said more than a year ago that if he were to become the Prime Minister, these grooming gang members will be brought to book. And Braverman has also said these grooming gang members should not be able to hide. Culprits must face the full force of the law for their crimes. This is what the UK Home Secretary has come out and said. So the government, especially Suella Braverman, is facing a lot of backlash. The critics are claiming that lawmakers are making this an issue based on ethnicity. They are saying that you cannot broad brush an entire community for the work of a few. This approach could hamper the tackling of crime is also a position that's being saying that all perpetrators need not necessarily be from one background. The government is fueling a view and perception of this issue is now becoming an Asian problem. Now, look at it. They're broad brushing Asians itself. It's actually British Pakistani origin and certain clans. But the investigative reports, and when we spoke to Charlie Peters, he says so far only 2 cities have been investigated thoroughly. This menace could have spread to more than 47 towns and cities of Britain. Clearly, grooming gangs is a British shame, and it needs to be cracked down at the earliest.